Wow, look at that. I'm really pleased to be here giving the third and final lecture in the series, A Biased Orientation to the Field of Contemporary Art. This is part three, psychology, which is to say these are artists who take as their subject something like their own inner life, loosely defined. And reminder, this is not scholarly, this is not curatorial, this is barely even chronological. If I gave these talks at school, I would maybe get a C. But this is my way of introducing myself to you by walking you through the museum of my mind. And these are the artists and the artworks that I love. And these are the ones who form the points of the compass for me as I orient myself to the field. Oh, Taylor. So this painting, actually, I use, believe it or not, as the introduction to our strategic plan. It's called Building the Boat While Sailing. So Dana Schutz is a 45-year-old artist. She really emerged in the early 2000s. And this painting looks chaotic, right? It looks like a mass of bodies. And it takes some time to sort of disentangle what's happening here. It's hard to tell that these people are actually building something. In fact, they're doing it sort of their own way. You could tell that here you could see there's like this woman here has some like planks with nails in them, and there's a saw over here. Maybe there's some sort of placing of something up here. There's some vague sense of building happening here. Now, despite the chaos, though, there is incredible unity to this composition, which is governed by a sort of triangular composition. So you can see here, this is a very structured painting around this tight triangle, and which is pretty much the basis of art history. You can see the very clear reference here to Géricault's Raft of the Medusa, has a similar subject matter and also a similar triangular composition. Which is why I would say, despite the sort of madness, the chaos of this painting, there's something about this painting which says also, don't worry, we got our own way of doing things here. I mean, if you look at it, you've got like some guy here who's kind of blowing water in the air. There's somebody here who's swimming. There's somebody here who has got his legs up in the air. This person seems to be working, but he's kind of on his head somehow. This is a group portrait of the ADHD generation. But I would say this, is that I feel that there's also no judgment on the part of the painter. I feel that this is their own way of doing things. There's a sense that like they've got this incredible unity. And even though not everybody is sort of doing things that are obviously productive, they're all somehow in it together. And there's this crazy feeling that I have looking at this painting that actually these guys, they are okay. Like the people who actually build boats, people who are sort of more actively productive, might have a much different style of building a boat while sailing, and probably wouldn't even recommend building a boat while sailing. But if you're going to do that, this might be the way of doing it. Sort of a little bit of leisure, a little bit of work, but you're still moving. And I have to say that I feel that the thing that makes me feel most endeared toward this painting is that you can't help but enter the mind of the person who conceived of it. I mean, it's somebody who's really not afraid to express their own quirkiness, like to do something that's outlandish, to be a goof, actually. And actually, therefore, there's something I find incredibly invulnerable about all of the work that Dana Schutz does. This is a painting from 2001 called Sneeze. This is gross. I know, it's gross. But it shows somebody in a kind of humiliating moment. So, and therefore, there's something also I find tender about it. It's like a memory of something that might have happened in an elementary school recess to some poor girl who maybe now is very successful lawyer, but you still have the memory of her somehow sneezing without covering her nose and snot coming out of her everywhere. But this is also in some ways a statement of the Instagram generation, where anytime somebody sneezes, it's worthy of being documented, right? And it's also on some level like part of the boom in memoirs, which started to occur in the 1990s and really took off in 2000s, around the time that Dana Schutz was doing these works, which is a world that implies that everyone's story is interesting. Everyone has something interesting to say. And I actually think that Schutz represents probably the best of what this era produces, because okay, we can make fun of that sort of Instagram generation, and the memoir generation, and I guess you could also loop into that reality TV and Oprah, and that world where like everyday people all of a sudden are their own celebrities. But also, like, this is an example of the fact that, in fact, if you dig deep enough, everybody does have an interesting story. Everybody has done something that was like completely humiliating. Everybody has some kind of trauma that defines who they are. Everybody has is caught in some inner structure that makes like their struggle to be who they are somehow heroic, not in a big H sense, but in a small H sense. And I guess this is an era where we're saying that the artist is saying I'm not making a big statement, but what I am saying is that I'm saying something in my own voice, with honesty and vulnerability, and what I'm saying says something about me. And I think that this painting here by Dana Schutz is one of my favorite paintings ever. I love this painting. It's extraordinary, not least of which because the subject is doing three things at once: swimming, smoking, and crying, which is also the title of the painting. And now, one thing about Dana Schutz is she's a master at composition. So even though you get a sense of the vast sea behind the figure, this sort of tightly composed head pushed up into the foreground, filling the majority of the frame, that creates a sense of intensity. You really feel a strong identification with this figure. It's also it's incredibly original. I mean, there is no art historical genre, by the way, of swimming, smoking paintings, in case you didn't know that. But like even in the way she paints it, there's no sort of painterly cliches. So she paints the sea at the bottom, the blue in the bottom here, like without any of the cliches of water. And when she does sort of give you that kind of traditional scalloped wave, it's actually ironic. It has a sort of sense of sort of quoting the genre. And the way that she creates these clouds, there's nothing traditional about the way she's creating that sense of the cloud. And there's something, of course, also like ultimately childlike about it. So with these exaggerated features and the truncated arm, it looks a little bit like caricature, something that you would actually find in a children's book or a graphic novel. And that's actually a theme that runs throughout this talk, that those artists who are exploring a sense of what I'm calling loosely psychology, but really just exploring the story of the self or the inner life, many of them often reference childhood and draw out that childhood sense in us in order to be able to have us connect to some sort of story about like what makes us who we are. But I would say this, is that this painting feels to me completely different from the entire history of other absurd works, which is, in our history called surrealism, right? So surrealism depicts very often absurdist or impossible scenarios as a way of creating a sense of like a dream-like archetype or some sense of like the mind rather than the world, some getting at some psychological essence. But I think what's interesting about this is that there's no sense of archetype here. I mean, it's actually vaguely realistic in a way. I mean, when you think about it, she's swimming, she's smoking, she's crying. I mean, isn't that relatively normal, right? She's trying to be healthy, she's falling back on some bad habits, and also just sort of not really able to bear it all. I mean, who hasn't felt this way, right? Where we're doing it all at the same time. We are, trying to get somewhere, but at the same time, we're just trying to survive. And so, like, this is an image of a person's struggle, and a pretty ordinary struggle, but something I love about that. And I would just say that, as I talked about last time, that if maybe the essential metaphor of the early 20th century was the window, and the essential metaphor of the late 20th century was the corner, the idea that we live in a world that's created by others. I'd say that the essential metaphor of our time is pretty well depicted by Dana Schutz, and I believe that it's the sphere, right? Where we each have around us a circle that defines those people who are willing to hear our story, some people who get our story as well. I mean, that's what all of social media is, isn't it? That's what our followers are. Of course, the line from Andy Warhol, everyone will be famous for 15 minutes. Well, that actually reflects a very, very old-fashioned idea of what fame is, right? It assumes that there's one platform for fame, and that's called, maybe that's like this, everyone read the same magazine at the time, right? Everyone read Life magazine the time that he was attributed with that quote. And nowadays, each sphere has its own circle. Each sphere has its own sort of media that they would use, and in a way, there's not a single sort of platform. Or if there is a certain platform, we each carve out spheres within that platform. The critic Jerry Saltz, I think, was the one who said, actually, the line right now should be, everyone will be in the future. Everyone will be famous for 15 people. And I think that's actually more accurately the way we're heading. That's the world of the sphere that we live in. And I believe that actually that's not entirely like the worst thing. Like that actually what we have to do in some ways is find the ways in which our struggle is interesting to people who find the way we describe that interesting as well. And so, and I believe that Dana Schutz is sort of the beginning. She's working, this painting was from 2012, but 2009. But she is really the beginning, I would say, of what the era that defines where we are now. And in the rest of this talk, I'm going to sort of go backwards in history and look at other artists who've explored the stories of the self or the inner life from very different perspectives, sort of led up to where we are now. So I think that the grandparent of the sort of figure, maybe for Dana Schutz, would be Louise Bourgeois. And she did this work in 1986, but Louise Bourgeois was born in 1911. She died in 2010. And she'd been making and exhibiting art since the 1930s, although it wasn't really until she was in her 70s, 1982, that she was recognized for her work, which is a fate that many women artists of her generation experienced when she had her retrospective at MoMA at that time. And this is an example of what we in art history call a grotesquerie. That's actually a technical term, which is to say a part animal, part human. And it's a porcelain sculpture, and you could feel in it all the different sort of issues. In it, there is motherhood, there's sexuality, a sense of power, protection. At the same time, it feels a little bit like the subject of a nightmare, right? This is a monster. I mean, you could see how there's both the really fierce claws, which are capable of protection and violence, and then you could see there's the way it's poised, sort of ready for action, though in a moment of stillness. So a lot is combined into this, and you could get the feeling that that combination of sort of protection on the one hand and the sort of actually monstrous quality of it, those two are actually sort of two sides, in a way, of the same coin. And because in some ways the idea this sculpture represents is that the figures that protect us are also our monsters. And at the same time, I would say that we have to also see in this and acknowledge this sense of delicacy of it. These are made of porcelain, and you could feel that while this statement is a powerful one, a powerful duality, it's also in some ways very, very like gentle way of making that statement. There's a sort of delicacy to how it's made. And the sense of a nightmare, though, is really most evident in Louise Bourgeois' spider works. She started those. I mean, she started doing drawings of them back in the earliest 1940s, drawings of spiders. But she started doing sculptures really in the 1990s. And I think it's fascinating that an artist who'd been making art since the 1930s, who very heavily explored psychoanalysis and explored issues of like the totem and archetypes in her art throughout her entire career, pretty much ended a very long life of art making with the spider, and continually referenced the spider in the last decades of her life. Well, spiders evoke terror, right? We associate spiders with like the things that lurk in the shadows. And even this spider, though, has something delicate about it. I mean, look at those legs are actually look very fragile. It's almost like it's a drawing in space. The lines of the leg are so fine. And when you think about a spider weaves a web, right? So the spider makes a fabric, but that fabric doesn't protect you. The fabric traps you, right? And this spider, it has a sense of architecture. The spider is something that you could sort of live under. It's got these sort of columns that hold up its sort of ceiling structure. But so their bodies in some ways create a space to live in. She's done a whole series. She did a whole series of spiders. Not all of them have that sense of architecture or space. This spider, which is in our museum collection from 1995 is actually more flat. But either way, one thing about spiders is that, and this is going to sound weird, but there's actually very little there in a spider. I mean, there's very little substance in a spider. It's mostly leg, right? It's mostly just sort of radial lines from a very small body. And it's interesting because that even though there's very little substance to them, they invoke so much fear. And in fact, I would even say that it's hard to look at these spiders and see them as symbolizing anything but the fear or nightmare. It's hard to sort of say like, oh, what delicate lines on the legs of that spider, because my experience of the spider is like the symbolic image of spider is so powerful that I immediately go to this feeling of like this nightmare, fear, the sort of terror aspect of what spiders do. Which is to say that their symbolic force is actually like much, is actually the predominant force that they have. And in many ways, like the symbolic force is much more significant than their actual power. And actually, I would say this, because they have so much symbolic force, they present themselves to us as if they were memories, not actually there, right? They become like almost symbolic forms that exist already in our head when we see them. And so what I think makes this work so powerful is that, and all of her spider work so powerful actually, is that they embody how the things that grip us, that control us, are not the things that are the real threats, the physical threats. Like actually, like physical threats, we can assess, we can navigate and sort of rationally figure out how to deal with. We know what they are, but the things that grip us are actually the things that don't have the substance to them, that are less physical. They're actually, I mean, I research like, why are people afraid of spiders? Like I didn't know, why are we afraid of spiders? Like they're not that dangerous compared to like most other things, right? But somehow, and actually, it's really interesting because no one has a really good answer to why we are afraid of spiders. There are some theories about like, well, it's because of spider, trauma, but that was really discounted. Like, no, most people's fear of spiders has nothing to do with a personal experience they have of trauma. And I think that partly what makes us fear spiders is the fact that there is not that much to them. And therefore, it ends up being more like those things that truly make us fearful, which are those things that are more like the invisible things of our lives, our memories or past traumas. It's not the thing itself, it's what we project onto it that terrifies us. And by the way, Louise Bourgeois' mother was a weaver, right? So she was someone who restored tapestries. And often she referred to, she made the reference to comparison between being a weaver and a spider. So therefore, there is some sort of sense of parenthood here. And sort of, even if you don't know that, though, you get the sense of sort of parenthood in this work. She did from 1997. So here the web is actually a cage, and this work you might not be able to make it out, but the inside there are tapestries and there's a chair. So it's really a sense of home inside the cage. And the spider, in some sense, you could read as guarding the home, protecting it. So the spider governs the structure that protects you, but if you live inside a protected space that somebody created for you, well, then you're living trapped inside a cage. And you don't have to read the spider that way. I think that you could also read the spider as, not about protection, but you can read this spider as your nightmare, which is to say that your fears actually create a home for you. Like your fear, you can live and you can nestle into your fears, right? But what kind of home is that? Is something that I take from Louise Bourgeois' sculptures. I believe that all of these issues are actually at play for her. A French artist, another French artist, whose work explores also her own, who begins with her own personal experience to describe, who begins with her own personal experience as a way of getting at bigger issues, is Sophie Calle. And Calle makes her personal life the subject of her art in a very, very intentional way. So she's currently in her late 60s, and she started emerging on the scene as early as the 1980s. And this is, most of her works have a combination of photography and text. I would describe her as a conceptual. Some people describe her as a conceptual photographer. Some people say she's a writer as well as an artist. But I think that, she definitely is an artist who blurs boundaries and defies kind of categories. So the text above this image of extreme profile is, when I was 14, my grandparents suggested that I needed plastic surgery. They made an appointment with a famous cosmetic surgeon, and it was decided that my nose should be straightened, that a scar on my left leg should be covered up with a piece of skin taken from my ass, and that my ears should be pulled back. I had doubts, but they reassured me. I could change my mind up until the very last moment. In the end, though, it was Dr. F himself who put an end to my dilemma. 2 days before the operation, he committed suicide. So even though this story is intensely personal, the power, I think, of this artwork comes from what is not said, right? The pain of a 14-year-old girl being told that she's inadequate, that she needs plastic surgery to be able to look normal, and the confusion of emotions on learning that somebody who you don't know, but yet was going to have a very, very intimate effect on your life, committed suicide. And the idea that the person who is in some level healing a wound of yours was himself deeply wounded. So I think the power of all of her artwork happens in those, in that space between what is said or what is represented in either image or text, and what is absent, and therefore left all to reverberate in your own imagination as you feel the emotional intensity of these situations that are explained in these very deadpan ways. I mean, what's amazing is that for an artist who works both with text and image, who's sort of piling it on in a way, that only reinforces the gaps in representation, the inability, the failure to represent the fullness of lived experience. This is another work similar, this autobiography series from 1992. And you can see here a photograph which says Little White Chapel, and there's 2 people in a car and happily a couple. The text here says, Tuesday, March 10th, 1992 at 10:50 a.m. He threw the following in my direction: an empty tea kettle, a butcher's block, a yellow love seat, 4 pillows, a biography of Bruce Nauman, and a black phone. When the phone hit the wall, I understood it would be preferable to meet his request and listen. By 1 p.m., everything was back in order except for a hole left in the wall. I hid this last bit of evidence with our wedding picture. So you see here a picture that you, I guess, assume is their wedding picture. But the detective-like cataloging of the events that took place in that scenario, that covers over the emotional intensity of that event. Just like the happy photograph of two people getting married covers over the violent reality of their relationship. And really here you get a sense that like her subject matter, what she's exploring, is the inevitable failure of trying to represent life in its fullness in the past, right? That in some level, like even the photograph of a situation on some level replaces the actual thing. Like the hole in the wall that's replaced by the photograph. Like, yes, photographs give us memories, but they also stand for all of our memories of our actual experience. So therefore, while they give us something, they also, to some extent, cover up and take away something. I know that I think about this all the time. Like I feel like I try to remember my father who died over 20 years ago. I feel like I can only remember the things that I've already created as memories. The pictures that I have become the memory, the things that I've already told as stories. And I feel like that's a way that representation ends up working. That when we represent something, that ends up becoming its own reality. I believe that she's exploring these aspects of how memory works. This is a project, I'm not expecting you to read this, don't worry, but she actually does several projects where she takes on assignments for herself, and these are fantastic kind of projects that she will take on. So in this case, what she does is, she did this in the 1980s, what she did was she found an address book on the street. Oh, by the way, you all know what an address book is, right? It was really popular in the 20th century. So people used to do is they used to write down everybody they knew and they had to contact them. It's funny. So she found an address book on the street, and it had the person's name, who owned it, and their address, and she returned it to that person. But before she did that, she photocopied every page. And then she went through and she interviewed everybody in the book about that person. So like this is an example of one of the pages that she created. It's Saturday, Paul B, 12:30 to 1:30 p.m. He agrees to meet me in a cafe in Barbe. I disclose the identity of the man with the address book. Then quote, she transcribes what the person says about them. I met him at the film magazine where I worked. At the time, he was passionate about cinema. He wrote dense theoretical texts, which in hindsight were very good, a bit obsessive. 2 or 3 years later, he was suspected of having maintained links with the Communist Party, and he left the magazine. And she goes on and on about this person's memories of him and working together with him at the magazine. And then she has another page that says, Friday, Martine R., 1 to 1:30 p.m., in a bar in Montparnasse, talking about Pierre D., that's the person whose book it was, talking about Pierre D., she tells me, it was during the week following his mother's death that his hair turned white. That's all she has of Martine's memory of Pierre. So by interviewing everybody in an address book, she gets everyone's subjective perspective of him. And so it's a portrait of Pierre that's in some ways more complete, but also more imperfect than a photograph or a biography, because it's just a piling on of subjective perspectives. And so this is another example where some ways to give you more evidence is only to emphasize the impossibility of ever getting to a complete description of something, or someone in this case. And it's not just the fact that you get like different perspectives. So it's not just about like, oh, how there is no right perspective. It's not just about objectivity. You really get a sense that she is involved in this, that she's putting herself on the line. I don't know if you get that feeling from just reading these two little excerpts, but I really have a very strong sense of like her vulnerability in calling people up or writing to them, and sitting down with strangers to talk to them about someone who she doesn't know. And so you really get a sense, like, actually, like, she believes that everyone's story is worthwhile, right? That and the question really is how close you are willing to get to find that out. Because she puts her, I feel like what makes this so powerful is that she puts herself on the line in order to find out really the depth of somebody else's story. A completely different take on the sort of psychological comes from, I'm just going to say too, and the way that these photographs work in relationship to them, again, they're adjacent to the story. They're not illustrative of the story. And therefore, it further widens the gap of between yourself and the sense of truth, right? You never get the feeling like, okay, what I'm getting at is the attempt to come at a complete picture. What you're getting at more and more is a sort of more and more poetic examination of this individual. So another very different perspective on sort of psychological expression in art comes from artist Monohatum. She's also about the same age as Sophie Calle. She's about 70 years old, born in Beirut. She is Palestinian in descent, and her work has a political dimension to it, though much of it deals with the sense of home and domesticity. And this here is a cube created with suspended barbed wire. And the barbs on the wire, you could tell, give them a sense of softness. They create, you kind of, it's hard to almost to focus on these as lines because the barbs create a little bit of vibration around the edges of the line. So you have this form that at the same time as it appears like soft is also brutal and violent. And then, I mean, the cube, as we've talked about earlier, is in many ways a symbol of modern life, right? It's the room, it's the space we occupy. And barbed wire is probably the symbol of, or at least it evokes, the worst of human behavior in some ways. And I think that she wants this ambiguity of violence on the one hand and softness on the other, as if to point out that actually there are situations where those two can be back to back, can be part of the same experience. And a work that when I saw this in 2000, it's a work called Homebound, I felt I understood it immediately. Is very simple, where she just takes a domestic environment as an installation. She has a table, chairs, household objects, lamps, bucket, and she runs electricity through them all. And the electricity runs in this very, very visible way. You can see the wires. Everything is sort of part of the electricity is part of the work. And these lines here, these are sort of kind of create a sense of boundary, confinement. These are wires that are like the boundaries of the home. And I feel like this is a very powerful depiction of the idea that in the home, because it is home, because it is a place where memories are formed, where those structures that take place in the home end up having a power over us for the rest of our lives. Because it is home, everything is charged. At the same time, it's like, because it's electric, it's not necessarily bad. It's just charged, right? And being charged has both the quality of everything is alive, right? Everything has meaning, But at the same time, it could also be dangerous. Electricity is that way, right? It gives you vitality, but it also has that sense of danger. It has potential to hurt you if not properly handled. An artist who is one of my favorite artists is, have I said that a lot? I probably have. Oh, it's like my favorite artwork, my favorite artist. Well, anyway, these are all like my loves. And I exhibited this artist, Argentinian-born artist Liliana Porter, one of my very first exhibitions I curated in 2000. I still love her work. She's about 81 years old right now. And this is an earlier work of hers. This is from 1973. And she started off in the 1970s with these works that you see. Basically, it's actually it's a photograph with the line continuing from her finger onto the page. So what she's playing with here is she's playing with the relationship between what is virtual and what is real, right? Because we take a representation as being, that's a representation is just, we think about, oh, that's just a virtual effect. Whereas the line that's on her hand, we're like, oh, that's real, right? And yet there's no reason that the line on her hand is any more real than the line on the page, right? They're both representational, right? It's all virtual. But somehow we want to believe that things have more reality than others. It's really just our inner experience, the way our mind processes information, that we somehow process some forms of representation as more real than others. And she did a whole series of works that are these very theoretical, very conceptual, you would say, explorations of that relationship between the virtual and the real. And then, what I love about her is that she then, as if all of a sudden, realized, like, oh, wait, like that relationship between what's real and what's virtual is also entirely how we process emotions. So therefore, the reason that we are moved by stories and moved by images is that we perceive them as being real, right? And so she's playing with this idea of how it is that representation has power over us. And in this case, I love this idea, like this dog is on a little notebook paper that's being pulled by this, piece of string. Or here, this is a photograph she has of a penguin, of a figure of a penguin talking to a Jesus Christ lamp. And you have this and now these they play upon our how it is that our minds sort of identify so easily with these representations. Aren't we amazing in that it doesn't take much for us to feel the connection between things, even a lamp, and a penguin, and a toy penguin. We could feel the emotional connection between them. And I when I see this, I'm like, it's almost like the penguin's like, oh, I hear that humans think you're pretty important. I almost sort of say, I almost imagine the dialogue between this penguin and this Jesus Christ lamp, and or I don't know, maybe there's something about the fact that the idea that probably the greatest figure in Western society, Jesus Christ, is an unplugged lamp, right? And somehow we don't see that as being unusual. We don't see that as being unusual, but while we somehow see a penguin looking at the lamp as being weird. Anyway, maybe you're not getting this. Maybe I'm not explaining it well enough. But here's another body of work. It is a body of her work. I think she does these installations, And here she has these tiny figurines, these tiny figures. And here you have this a woman, a tiny figurine of a woman on a little piece of wood, and then a piece of fabric over here. And there's a little piece of pink string that the woman is holding in her hand. And and so you're this feeling like, wow, that's a really big project for such a little person, or she has, or this work here, this guy is like, wow, like he's doing a lot of painting, or he's kind of sloppy in his painting. Anyway, so I feel that there's something about all of these works that play upon like what it is that makes children like love stories. And what I find interesting is the way that like we adults have the same triggers. Like we ourselves are fooled by representation to be able, like that's what the movies are. That's what all of art does to us, right? All it is just provide us with tricks of the mind to make us feel things, right? They're all representation, right? It's not like there are some things that are real and some things that are virtual. It's all, and what's amazing is that we use the same storehouse of emotions when we are feeling for these characters as when we feel for each other. So that it's not just like this describes how we relate to art, but this describes how we relate in general, right? That our mind has a trigger that connects to our sense of identification. And what is it that creates that sense of identification? Not that much. It doesn't take us much to feel for this guy and like how big a project he's got going on. Okay, I'm going to say it one last time because truly this is one of my favorite works of art. All right, I'm not going to say it. But I would say this, that this last work of art, I want to say that it like sometimes like almost bring me to tears. And I want to be able to convey what I think is so powerful about it. This is work by Mike Kelly, and the title is like a big part of the work. The title is More Love Hours Than Can Ever Be Repaid. He made it in 1987. And he created this work by stitching together handmade stuffed animals and blankets that he found in thrift stores. And every one of these things is sort of like that he amasses together like a Jackson Pollock painting, was made by somebody. Oops, that was Siri like talking to me. I don't know. But every one of these things was made by hand, embodies hours of labor, right? And therefore represents like gifts of love that somebody has given to a child. And there's something so intense to me about when you think about like the handmade gift, right? And therefore it starts to suggest a lot, right? It suggests how much love we humans require to feel whole, right? How much love we have to shower on children to feel, so they can feel complete. But it also says something that's about art, right? And I love the idea of art as love hours, right? The idea of the time it takes to make art is on some level love hours. So I don't believe this work is suggesting that the artist gives love that will never be fully returned from the viewer. I don't think that's what it's about. More love hours than can ever be repaid, I think suggests something like no matter how many love hours the artist put in, it will never be enough to relieve the burden that compels us to make art. Right, which is to say, I believe that this is essentially about some woundedness, right? This is about the woundedness that is that we try to heal with the blankets, the handmade blankets and the handmade toys. And I read it also to suggest that the reason that art works on us, the reason that all of this art has power over us, is that when we encounter art, we enter with our own deficits of love. And like, we're in the hole. And that's why the love hours end up filling us, and us feeling that emotional connection, because we're never squared away. And it's the reason that the artist will always want to make more art, and that's why we will always want more experiences with art. All right, I'll stop there. Keep the lights. Keep the lights. Questions? Questions? All right, can we have the lights? Thanks. All right, thank you. Hi. Okay. Question? Yes. Oh. Here, just. Oh, hi, Louis. Thank you, Louis. Louis Baumgartner, our Chief Advancement Officer and also AV technician.
Thank you. I just wanted to know what the scale of that was.
Oh, well, you can sort of see the stuffed animals in there. It's probably about 5 feet in diameter.
Pretty big.
Diameter in width.
Given that psychology was the main focus of what you were doing here, I'd love to get your value add on what you're seeing coming through from the art world in the wake of COVID, where we were all internationally locked down together for 2 years. And in this country, there was Black Lives Matter and the Trump administration also, and points at which obviously mental health became extremely difficult for a lot of people. How are people now representing that? What do you see?
Wow, it's interesting. I actually see it much more in literature than I see it in visual art. Like when I look at the art that's being made today in studios, I don't see much difference, and I get the feeling that many artists did pretty well, actually, during COVID. Many visual artists, my rough sense, were actually quite comfortable working in their studios and not being entirely social. I think that makes sense because artists very often are at home in the world of things. But I do feel that in literature, I think in fiction especially, where the imagination was so occupied by a world where we are wearing masks, and a world where we are confined, I think that you have like a wave of stories. If you read the New Yorker fiction, for example, like you see a wave of stories that all like take as their subject matter actually a pandemic. Even Gary Steingart's recent novel, I think that takes place in the pandemic, and you really do you get a strong sense of that it's hard to express anything except the pandemic when you're in a pandemic. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for the lecture. Very nice. You're very well spoken, very insightful, really easy to listen to. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. Is there a but? No.
Next. You made me think about the tension between simplicity and complexity as a psychological component that you have to deal with. The gentleman just talked about COVID. It's very simple. You stay home, you wear a mask, you don't go anywhere. But it produces a lot of complexity in your life. Anxieties, what's going to happen, the unknown. Which is why I got to gravitate to people like Giorgio Morandi and Nicholas de Stael. Just boil it down and that's it. What are you seeing in the tensions between simplifying complexity in various modes of art, and how are they being expressed, and what are people saying?
Well, it's interesting. I haven't thought about using the sort of dichotomies of simplicity and complexity in relationship to art. Though I do have a strong sense that that actually that everything is simple. You just that things on some level when they're complex, it's because we want them to be something different, and we haven't yet. We're trying to rationalize them in certain ways. I have a very strong sense of that, and in fact, like I think that when something is simple, like for example, this work here, which I think all the guy did was got stuffed animals and sewed them. And I think what makes it so powerful is that it's simple, but therefore resonates with everything, and therefore like you can kind of get lost in what you might call like the complexity and just explaining it, but actually it's a very, very simple work. And I think what I would say is probably things that are simple like have a richness to them very often that like might read as complexity, but I would say that to me I really feel like simplicity and richness often go hand in hand, and like what I would I mean again like to some extent like the artworks like what I think the most interesting point here is like for me is that like when you look at the whole body, I don't have many examples of it, but it's almost like when you look at the whole body of what Louise Bourgeois was doing, it was loosely like something like this, where she's trying to like find the things that are like go together. And I find it fascinating that after trying all these additive solutions, at the end of her life, she's just like, you know what? There's one thing that symbolizes it all, right? That actually symbolizes like the spider is what for her symbolized like all fear, like our entire symbolic life, our sense of projection onto the world, the sense of all of that seems, and I really like the fact that she simplifies in order to be able to broaden, and that's almost like that's the trajectory. Louis, yes, hello.
I had a couple of comments about what's been said so far, and one thing that strikes me is that the COVID experience was so similar in many ways, and it was quite simple, and you put on a mask and you were stuck at home. Not that people's responses were necessarily similar, but more than most situations. And to contrast that with like what's going on in the Ukraine, I was thinking about that when you showed the Mike Kelly, which I don't think what comes through in the slides is that the abjection of this work, and that they're kind of dirty, and it's not cheery at all. There's no sense of childhood joy, and I think that's one of the things that are so shocking about it. But in terms of Ukraine, this question I walked in with, is the museum doing anything even as simple as if you own Henry Moore that shows people in the underground during the bombardment of London? Is that going up near the door? Or how do we make some simple and responses to...
Wait, are you saying that Henry Moore, a Henry Moore that shows people?
That depicted people in the underground?
Oh, I don't think that we have that work.
But
yeah.
how we position ourselves in response to these, it's kind of mind-boggling, I think. And one thing I think that's interesting about Louise Bourgeois is that these are enormous works, these spiders. I think you referred to that when you talked about the them being like a home, but literally that you could build a home under many
Sometimes
of them.
some of them are, some of them aren't.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that it's funny because the reason I try not to read these artists the way that they've been always read. So therefore, like everybody reads Louise Bourgeois Spider as like, oh, it represents her mother because that's what the artist says. And for me, what is interesting about it is like my response to it. That is, I feel like I try to differentiate from what is like the story that is pre-given. But everyone's abject is probably the term that everybody uses to describe Mike Kelly. And I wanted I felt like I had a different place that I connected to in these works, and tends to be how I approach. I mean, some artists like are more aligned with the seriousness, but with this the way I described it is more aligned with the way that other serious curators talk about it and critics talk about it. But that's just explaining how and why I describe things the way I did. Cool. We have a few more questions. Thank you.
Yes, it's a question really about theme and environmentalism. And the Mike Kelly thing that struck me the most was that it's very sad because he got these from thrift shops, which means that people disposed of this
Yeah.
love item.
Right.
And it's sad, and it's not only do we dispose of plastic, but we even dispose of things that were made with so much love.
Yeah.
So that has been in the past environmental art to make a statement. Now, is that over? I mean, that's a really interesting question because I haven't seen anything new in that world. There's a great body of art, but I don't know where the trend is going here.
Well, I'm not talking about trends, and I mean, so I don't know honestly what the trend is with environmental art. I would say that my sense is that a lot of young artists are interested in it. I haven't seen anything that really struck me recently that I could really refer to, and it's sort of my topic was a little bit different. I was really just trying to talk about the works that sort of informed my own sense of my approach to art. But yeah, so I don't really have, and I would say this is interestingly, I don't think that probably the work of art that I think I like the most that touches upon environmentalism is probably the one that's upstairs in the gallery by Robert Longo. Oh yeah. Yeah, yeah, and the work of art in the Longo exhibition is the iceberg, and it's so pushed forward to in the composition. There's almost no foreground at all. It's like a flat wall that's right up against the viewer, and it occupies the entirety of this enormous work that. And yet it's you could see the erosion that takes place, which is you could tell the global warming effects from the actual physicality of this iceberg, and at the same time it's absolutely beautiful. Like it's so delicate and yet also so monumental. I feel like the entire intensity of environmental crisis feels like it's being represented in that work. But yeah, but that's not it. But he's I love him. He's a little bit older guy. I'm not sure what the young kids are saying right now about environment that I have to refer to. Yes. Mhm. Yeah. Great. Yeah. I mean, I love the Desert X. So thank you. Do we have any other questions? No? Okay. Thank you. Have a good night. You know, I just want to let you know that our spring exhibitions will open April 20th, 21st. We have 2 events. We have a kind of gala dinner, preview dinner on the 20th, and a public party on the 21st with headlining Nancy Wang from LCD Sound System, who you all know, of course. And it should be a great events, but also the exhibitions are wonderful exhibitions, and I really look forward to having you join us for that. And we've got really wonderful lectures coming up later this month. Brad Dunning will be talking about the modern chair exhibition. You know, he is the modern chair guy. He curated the exhibition for us, and he'll be talking. He's got a wealth of knowledge. Hope you'll participate in that. And Barbara Gothard is an regional artist who did a research-based exhibition on African American homesteaders in the desert, and sort of translates that into art, her historical information into art. That should be a really fascinating talk as well. So hopefully you'll join us for that. Okay, great. Thanks, guys. Thank you.